This is Horror Podcast.
Welcome to This is Horror, a podcast for readers, writers, and creators. I'm Michael David Wilson, and every episode alongside my co-host Bob Pastorella, we chat with the world's best writers about writing, life lessons, creativity, and much more. Today we are chatting to Joe Hill, the #1 New York Times best-selling author of The Fireman, Heart-Shaped Box, Nosferatu, Strange Weather, and his latest book, King Sorrow. Now, Joe is someone who I have wanted to speak to for a long time now. We ran an episode back with him in 2013 when my former co-host Dan Howarth spoke with Joe in the back of a Waterstones before a UK book event promoting Nosferatu. That was a 15-minute appetizer into the wonderful mind and life of Joe Hill, but this is the main event. As you might expect, we begin things by talking about Joe's early life. We then dive into his writing process, talk about his writing journey, and even get into why he goes by Joe Hill rather than taking on the King family name. We also talk a little bit about his latest release, King Sorrow, although sadly the hour limit meant we didn't get to dissect it in the manner I would have liked, but we can save all of that for the next time. So I think you're going to have a really wonderful time with this one. But before we get into it, a quick advert break.
From the host of This Is Horror Podcast comes a dark thriller of obsession, paranoia, and voyeurism. After relocating to a small coastal town, Brian discovers a hole that gazes into his neighbor's bedroom. Every night she dances and he peeps. Same song, same time, same wild and mesmerizing dance. But soon Brian suspects he's not the only one watching, and she's not the only one being watched. They're Watching is The Wicker Man meets Body Double with a splash of Suspiria. They're Watching by Michael David Wilson and Bob Pastorella is available from thisishorror.co.uk, Amazon, and wherever good books are sold.
It was as if the video had unzipped my skin, slunk inside my tapered flesh, and become one with me.
From the creator of This Is Horror comes a new nightmare for the digital age, The Girl in the Video by Michael David Wilson. After a teacher receives a weirdly arousing video, his life descends into paranoia and obsession. More videos follow, each containing information no stranger could possibly know. But who's sending them, and what do they want? The answers may destroy everything and everyone he loves. The Girl in the Video is The Ring meets Fatal Attraction for the iPhone generation. Available now in paperback, ebook, and audio.
Okay, with that said, here it is. It is Joe Hill on This Is Horror. Joe, welcome to This Is Horror.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So, to begin with, I want to go all the way back to your childhood because I want to know what some of the early life lessons were that you learned growing up in Bangor, Maine.
You want me to? You want to go all this like sitting down with my therapist? I want to take you back to your childhood.
This is it.
When I say the word mother, what's the first thought that comes to your? Let's play a word association game. I'll say mother, and you say a word. So mother, knife. Father, rage. No. Bangor, Maine. I had a terrific childhood in a moderate-sized town. It's not quite the small town. It is, it's Derry, in my dad's books, and the representation of it that you get in it is pretty accurate to the history of the place or the geography of the place. The history has maybe been darkened a little, but then again, maybe not that much. But the town that I grew up in, it's a terrific American town, good folks, real working class town. And I think one of the reasons that my parents remained extremely grounded is because they never moved out. My dad, just to get it out of the way, my dad's the writer, Steve King. When they made it, when they hit it big, they didn't move to LA or, New York City or anything. They stayed right in Bangor. My dad has been in AA for over 25 years, and I think that's kept him grounded too. When he talks about his peers, he's not talking about other writers, he's talking about drunks, people he meets in the room in the church basement with the bad coffee where they all introduce each other by their first names. So, I think it was really healthy, that it was not a particularly sheltered childhood. It was the kind of 1980s childhood that freaks, the millennials out. They see it in Stranger Things and they think to themselves, could that really have, could you really just ride around on your bikes all day long and no one knew where you were? And I'm like, yeah, pretty much, you had to be back by dark, but my parents never gave it another thought. So I think that was healthy, right? Because you got yourself into trouble. You were 10 riding around with your friends on your bikes and you got into trouble, but you also learned you could get yourself out of it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And in terms of the stories, I will often ask people, what were your first experiences with story? But you're in a unique position because
Right.
obviously your dad was writing all of
And
these
my mother
horror
too,
stories.
right? And my mother too. My
Yeah.
mother is a quite accomplished novelist, Tabitha King. She's written like 7 terrific American novels about working class life in Maine. The subject that she knows best. Their first years of marriage, she was, the manager of a Dunkin' Donuts, fighting off handsy customers, and my dad, who was a English teacher at Hamden Academy, couldn't make enough money teaching to really support the family. And so he had to work summers at an industrial laundry, washing sheets for hotels and stuff like that. So that was kind of their starting point. But books were everything to them. They met in a poetry workshop. And when I was a kid, it sounds very Victorian to say, but after dinner, we'd all gather together in the den, not to watch TV, but to pass a book. I remember very clearly that's how I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because we passed that book around as a family. My dad would read 5 pages. My mom would read 4. My sister would read 3. I'd read 2 and my brother would read 1. We'd read aloud. So I got used to, when I do a reading in public or something, I have ideas about how to deliver that because I've had a lot of practice reading aloud to others going back to childhood. And, my dad was always looking to maximize his writing time and his reading time. And in the 80s, the audiobook market was barely existed. And what you could do is you could walk into a B. Dalton and you could get audiobooks, but they were always highly abridged. It would be a whole Ed McBain novel squished down into 2 long playing cassettes. So really you were getting if it was an Ed McBain, you were getting half the book. If you were listening to, a Jack Higgins novel or something, you were getting maybe a quarter of the book. What a hideous, the thought makes me, my skin crawl just to think about it. My dad had some ways of getting unabridged books, but he also, there were a few specialty companies that did the whole, it was fairly expensive, but you could get the whole book on audio cassette. He got all of Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry on something like 26 cassettes. I actually have it was read by a guy named Wolfram Kadinsky, who was a terrific reader. I've actually got those box sets of audio tapes in my basement right now. But the other thing is he hired his children to read books on audio for him. So my sister, myself, and my brother all read, Larry Block and Donald Westlake and Harold Robbins, and read this stuff on audio tape for almost $20 an audio tape. It was good walking around cash. So it was a very literary. Stories were threaded through right into the tapestry of the family from the beginning.
Yeah, and I understand too. It wasn't just through reading that you experienced stories and horror, because by age 9, you were in the wraparound segments for George A. Romero's Creepshow.
Right. I sometimes talk about, it seems obvious that I should, given that my dad is Steve King, it seems obvious that I wound up writing horror. But there were actually a few other influences there that played a really important role. And one is I was cast in Creepshow when I was 8 years old. I played Billy, the kid with the voodoo doll, who gets even with his father at the end of the film. The movie was made on a low budget in Pittsburgh in, I want to say, 1981, independent film. And child labor laws have come a long way in the years since. So now, if you have a child actor, you have to have an on-set tutor and an on-set nanny. And I think they're a lot stricter about how many hours the kids can work, although I didn't work. They were quite reasonable with me. They didn't have anyone to look after me on set. There was no professional hand to watch out for the 8-year-old. So George Romero thought about it, and he stuck me in the trailer with Tom Savini, the master of gross-out special effects. And that's where I spent the week that I shot my part, was in Tom Savini's trailer. And I've often talked about how he was my first rock star. Tom wore motorcycle boots and a leather jacket, and he had these arched eyebrows like Spock in Star Trek. And he's fucking cool. I'd sit there under his workbench and watch him disfigure movie stars with latex appliances, or work on one of his fiends, one of his monsters, a rotting corpse, or the thing that came out of the crate in the middle segment of the film. And, I saw the behind the scenes stuff where they basically had a reverse vacuum to pump cockroaches out of a latex corpse, a fake corpse. And I was just completely fascinated. I wasn't repelled or frightened or upset about it. I remember he had a book of autopsy photos, and I was curious. And so he sat with me and looked at them and said I didn't have to look at anything I didn't want to look at. But if I was curious, he'd be happy to talk to me about it. And I was at that age before some things are supposed to be upsetting. So I wasn't upset. I just thought, oh, how natural, how normal. That's what someone looks like when they're dead. That's interesting. And he never talked to me like I was a kid. He just seemed to treat me like I was a grown-up peer. And I just came away feeling like, man, that's what I want to do when I grow up. I want to kill people in really fascinating, memorable ways. And I want to invent, memorable creatures, which is what I wound up doing. I just do it on the page. And not long after my experience on the set of Creepshow, I was probably a couple years older, but I began reading Fangoria magazine. So Fango to the faithful. Fangoria was this long-running magazine dedicated to horror movies and horror novels and the comic books and TV, and it especially made big stars out of guys like Rob Bottin and Tom Savini and Stan Winston and, the masters of that era of practical gross out effects. And, I read Fango cover to cover. That was like my Time magazine. I had strong opinions about every horror film that came out because, I knew all about it from reading Fango. And Fango, people forget, but the original run of Fango, those magazines had centerfolds in them. sort of like Playboy and the other lad magazines have centerfolds. But the thing is in Playboy, the centerfold was like you open it up and there's a hot girl wearing a pair of socks and a smile and nothing else. But you open up the centerfold of Fango and it's some Gomer with an axe buried in his head and his eyeballs bulging out and, gore spattering everywhere. And I pulled those centerfolds out and taped them up on the wall of my bedroom. In a completely unrelated bit of trivia, I held on to my virginity for a really surprisingly long period of time. Who can fathom it? Really?
Completely coincidental
Yeah.
and unrelated, I'm sure.
So I mean, I always, no pun intended, I had it in my blood. It was always, I loved horror films from an early age. I loved reading this stuff. It goes without saying, I was a huge Stephen King fan. Maybe we'll talk about it. I did try my hand. I went through a little period of thinking like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to be a writer when my dad is Steve King? That was in college. And that's when I dropped my last name to write as Joe Hill, so people wouldn't know about the connection. And I was able to keep it secret for a fairly long period of time. But the other thing I did for at least a little while was I stopped writing horror and dark fantasy. Because I thought, Steve King's son can't write this stuff. It just looked like he's grabbing his daddy's coattails. And so I tried my hand at writing New Yorker stories, the kind of fiction that you found in like the Atlantic Monthly and the New Yorker and stuff. And I mean, of course, the problem was that I didn't really like that stuff. I didn't read the New Yorker. I was a Fango guy, not a New Yorker guy. I didn't read Cheever and Updike. I knew about Richard Matheson and Ray Bradbury. And so it was a really unnatural fit for me. And the stories were boring. They got turned down everywhere, and I'm not surprised. They weren't interesting to me, so how could they possibly interest an editor? They did have some technical polish. I by the time I was in my early 20s, I'd say on a sentence by sentence level, I was a pretty polished, stylist. But the stories themselves had no internal life. They were just dead on the page. And I only really found my way when I gave myself permission to write horror fiction, to write fantasy and dark stuff. And the pen name, sorry to blab on, but to finish the story, the pen name is what gave me permission to write horror, because I thought, well, Joseph King can't write horror fiction because he looked like he was grabbing his dad's coattails. But no one knows who Joe Hill is. He's just Joe Schmo. He can write whatever he wants. So it freed me up to write the kind of stuff that I actually like to read. And shortly afterwards, after I made this decision, I wrote a story called Pop Art, which is in 20th Century Ghosts. And, it was the first story. It sold to the third place I sent it. And it was the first story I wrote that I was, really, really proud of, really excited about.
Yeah, I think Pop Art might be the first story that I read by you. I think it's the one that a lot of people were like, you got to check this out. You got to buy the collection, but you've got to read Pop Art. Yeah,
I think I wrote that story. I think I wrote the first draft of that story when I was like 28, 29 or something. It's been all downhill since then. I peaked early. But for those who don't know, Pop Art is in my first collection of book of stories called 20th Century Ghosts. There's only one story in that collection that's even older than Pop Art. That one is about, Pop Art is about the friendship between a juvenile delinquent and an inflatable boy named Arthur Roth. Arthur's made of plastic and filled with air. He weighs about 6 ounces. And if you ever sat in a sharpened pencil, it would kill him. And in the story, it's explained that this is just a genetic condition that skips generations sometimes. And otherwise the story is played completely straight. And, I had a lot of fun writing it. And that one seems to have stuck around a little bit.
Yeah, and since releasing the short story collection, then you wrote Heart-Shaped Box, and then after that, like the novels have got meatier and meatier in terms of just the length of them. So, I mean, I'm wondering, what are the kind of challenges that you face when, graduating from short stories to shorter novels and then to these epic novels?
Yeah.
And what do you think are the advantages?
Stephen King-sized books.
Well,
Stephen Kingian scale novels.
That's it.
So I sort of stumbled backwards into writing the first novel because, as I've said elsewhere, and it's kind of some it's old info. People have heard me talk before on interviews. Well, they will have heard this one once or twice, but basically, I was a failed novelist. By the time I was 30, I had written 4 books that no one wanted to buy. I took my best swings with them, but the last one was called The Fear Tree, and it was big. It was as big as Nosferatu. And, it was turned down by every publisher in New York, every publisher in London. And for a final degrading kick in the crotch, it was turned down by every publisher in Canada, which is proof that no matter how low you've fallen, you could still fall further yet. But so by the time I was in my very early 30s, I'd pretty much given up on the idea that I had a novel in me. I felt like I really wanted to do this, and I really thought I'd be able to pull it off. But I've taken my best swings, and it wasn't in me. Those books were not things people wanted to buy. I guess I don't know how to do that. I had figured out how to write a short story. I knew I could write a good short story. I had written short stories that were in best of collections, and short stories that had been nominated for prizes, or won prizes. And I had enough short stories to make a collection. And I thought, well, I was never able to publish a novel, but maybe I can sell a book of short stories, and there'll be some kind of triumph in that. And also by then I had sold an 11-page Spider-Man story to Marvel, and I had started to think, fuck novels, I'll just be a comic book writer. I can do this. I get comics, and people like my comic book scripts. So, the book of short stories, 20th Century Ghosts, that was also turned down by all the major publishers, but it wound up in front of a terrific horror and fantasy writer named Peter Crowther. Peter has a collection of his own called The Longest Single Note. That's a wonderful compilation of his best stories and highly recommended. Really just terrific genre wanderer. He writes fantasy, light fantasy, horror, suspense, science fiction. I love Pete's stuff. But anyway, Pete had a small press of his own called PS Publishing. And he read a few of my stories. And on the strength of pop art, almost completely on pop art, he really liked Best New Horror and the title story, 20th Century Ghost, as well. On the strength of those 3 stories, he decided to do a limited run of my collection. And that's how I broke through. That's how I finally got a book. That was in 2005. Pete asked me to write 2 more stories for that book. And so, because he said, all these other stories have been previously published. Let's offer readers something they can't get anywhere else. So I did 2 new stories, or I started 2 new stories. The first one was called The Cape, and that one turned out pretty well and is one of the best stories in the book. And then I started this other one called Dead Man's Suit. Dead Man's Suit is about a heavy metal musician named Judas Coyne. He's in his 60s. He's had a pretty successful career, platinum albums, world tours, but now he's on the downslope. And he's banging around his upstate New York mansion all by himself. The only one up there is with him is his groupie, much younger groupie girlfriend. And they're on the outs. They hardly talk to each other. The only thing that really brings him pleasure is he's got a cabinet of curiosities. And in that cabinet of curiosities, he's got a witch's confession from the 18th century. He's got a trepanned human skull. It's got a snuff film. And he hears about someone selling a haunted suit online. And he decides he's just got to have it for his collection. And like anyone listening to this podcast, can tell just hearing that this is a terrible fucking idea. But he buys the suit anyway, and it turns out the ghost attached to it is very real and very dangerous. And I always thought that Jude, who was kind of a prick, I always thought, Jude would realize his mistake too late and the ghost would eat him for breakfast by page 30. And I'd have one more story for Pete Crowther. But a funny thing happened on the way to the ending, which is that Jude wouldn't die on my schedule. Every time I stomped on him, I'd lift my shoe and he'd scuttle away again like a cockroach. And it became kind of fascinating to see how long he could keep running. And it turned out he could keep running for 300 pages. And that's how I wrote my first novel. And along the way, I kind of got to like Jude. And I kind of started to think he's not as bad a person as we thought he was when we first met him. That a lot of that rage, a lot of his cold, aloof nature was actually sort of a defense mechanism against a guy who had been hurt a lot of times, who had suffered a lot of damage and didn't want to suffer anymore. But that was a nice, lean, mean. I mean, I see you got like a Dean Koontz there on the back of on your bookshelf behind you, Michael. It was like a Dean Koontz, like, an early Dean Koontz thrillers, ran hard as a road story. My hero spent a lot of time with this ghost after him, chasing him like the Terminator, and then I wrote a follow-up called Horns, which was about the same size, a different kind of book. It's kind of a horror novel. It's kind of horror adjacent. It's kind of like a horror comedy in a way, or a horror tragedy, or a horror tragicomedy. I sound like Polonius in Hamlet, the horror tragicomedy. So then, Heart-Shaped Box had done really well. Horns had done okay. It was published. It took a few years to get written, and it was published after the big financial crash in 2008. And although it had a couple weeks on the bestseller list, I knew the publishers were a bit disappointed. But two things happened that made me think, I might be okay. One is they began filming a TV series based on my comic book, Lock and Key. And that gave me a little cachet. And then Daniel Radcliffe signed up to make a movie out of Horns. And it's, in some ways, Daniel Radcliffe did a lot to save my career when it was in not such a great place by agreeing to make that film, and but I just thought, okay, the next book has to be a home run. I really have to crush it, and I decided to consciously kind of try to write a book that was the sort of book that my dad is well known for. I decided I wanted to write a big, multicast, horror novel that took place over a fairly long period of time and had a lot of big set pieces. And I had an idea for a pretty distinctive and memorable monster at the center of it, a road vampire named Charlie Manx, who feasts on the souls of children. And I thought I could run with it. And so, so the next book was longer by design because I felt like I had to go bigger. I had to establish, my commercial bona fides and, really womp one to, get readers excited and build my following and all the rest of it. And I had a story I loved. I felt like, I had a character, Vic McQueen, at the center of Nosferatu that I was excited for. And, I just felt like I could really open up the throttle and run with that one. So that's how I wound up writing a long book.
Yeah, and so with Heart-Shaped Box, I mean, you really just started with this initial premise and then you ran with the idea. So presumably in terms of, initial planning, there wasn't so much planning. It was more we're writing, we're seeing where it's going. Is this something that you have kept up with to this day? Because if
I've never outlined. Yeah. I think outlines are garbage. I think they're a really bad idea. I mean, my approach is I try to come up with a concept that feels exciting and fresh. I had an idea for a story about a worldwide pathogen, a disease, kind of, a virus novel like The Stand. Only instead of killing people by superflu, people would be incinerated by spontaneous combustion. I thought there's something there. That's an exciting idea. A plague of spontaneous combustion. That hasn't been done before, and so you get the concept, but then what I want to apologize to all the listeners for the squeaking they just heard. That was me getting comfortable in the easy chair. It's great to have a high concept, a sticky high concept, but I need characters to care about. characters I can fall in love with. It takes months or years to write a novel. These are people I'm going to spend a lot of time with. They have to be interesting. I mean, I actually view each character almost as a kind of mystery that I'm going to pick apart. I want to know who they are, how they feel about the world, what excites them, what breaks their heart, what has broken their heart. What are their defeats look like? What do they count as their personal victories? What are their regrets? What's broken them as a person? This is all stuff I'm going to use the book to find out. And every novel and every short story is simply a thought experiment where you take a particular sharply defined individual and plop them into a situation and then see what happens. And if you do that, you don't need an outline and you don't need to plan. The character will always be make much more interesting choices than you ever could have planned if you just let them be themselves. This is going to start to sound a little woo-woo, new agey, a little bit, I don't know, a little bit out to lunch. But, there is this thing about writing character. You have these authors who will say, all my characters are based on me. They're all somehow autobiographical. And I think that's ridiculous. What a ridiculous way to write. It leaves no room for observation. Most of my characters are nothing like me and are not drawn from life. I'm not looking within. I'm looking outside at the people around me and trying to figure them out. I don't know. I'm not a 60-year-old heavy metal musician. I've never done a world tour. And all I've done is read some issues of Rolling Stone magazine. I wanted to get inside Jude, but Jude is not me. And the reason he didn't die on my schedule in Heart-Shaped Box is he kept making choices that I never would have thought of and never would have made. And I know this is where it gets kind of new agey, because you're saying to yourself, Joe, you thought him up. Every choice he made is obviously a choice you could have made. You thought his choices up. But in some weird, basic way, I didn't. Not really. I was just watching him. He only existed in my mind, but it's still more like an act of observation than imagination, where this character that seemed very clearly formed, on a sort of moment-by-moment basis was free to make choices that he would obviously make, but that maybe never would have occurred to me if I hadn't been spending time with him. So I know that's weird sounding because it kind of insists on a separate life to these characters that I did in fact dream up. But to me, that separate life is real. While I'm writing the story, those characters really are free to do what they want. And in some way, are constantly surprising me.
No, a lot of what you're saying here, it really resonates. And I've often found when I'm writing and when I have a kind of writing challenge, or there's what some people would term a block, although it's never a block for too long, but I'll often find that the solution is already baked into the story, or that the character has already foreshadowed what's going to happen anyway.
Always. It's already all there. Always. I think that a lot of times when you get stuck in a story, midway through a story, it's because you're trying to force your characters to do something that they don't want to do, and that deep down they wouldn't do. That they wouldn't agree to split up in the old swamp or something. They're just too smart. They wouldn't, they couldn't be talked into that choice, whatever. And what you're thinking, you're panicking, because if they don't take the next step, then they won't take the step after that. Then they won't take the step after that. And then you won't get to write that scene you've been planning for 2 months, because you're never going to get to that scene, because they're going to turn left instead of going straight ahead. But if you let them turn left, they always take you someplace more interesting anyway. You wind up writing an even better scene because it's true. It feels authentic and honest.
I was going to say, this makes me feel a lot better about the last time I tried to plot something. A couple months ago, I spent and wrote about 50 pages in a notebook of a basic story that is going to be pretty involved. And when I felt like I was comfortable enough to start writing about it, what do? I go way before the fucking story starts.
Right.
And my main characters are teenagers and go, okay, I'm starting here. And as I'm going through all these characters that I created that were going to cause problems, as I'm writing this, I'm like, the character I needed is right here the whole time.
Yeah.
It's like, why do I need this guy when I have this person right here who's been here the whole time? And so, do I feel bad about spending all this time about writing an outline? I'm like, because I'm notoriously a pantser. I do not plot anything.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm gonna try this again for the umpteenth time. And do I feel bad about that? No, because I have some ideas. I have some set pieces that I know I want to do, that I want to get through.
Yeah.
So I feel like that writing an outline should be about the events and have very little to do with the characters, because the reason why I started those characters so young is because I wanted to find out about them.
Who they were. You
I
want to
wanted to
figure
know
out
who they were.
are.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't really think that there's wasted work. There's some poet who said there's no such thing as the wrong step. There's just the next step.
Mm-hmm.
And I look back now on the books that I was never able to publish. And boy, I pulled all kinds of things out of those books over the years. It's in my most recent novel, King Sorrow, which is probably the last long one for a while. But in the most recent one, the first part of the book is called The Briars, Part 1. But The Briars is also the title of my last unpublished novel. And I used the location in that unpublished novel as Colin Wren's, one of the characters is named Colin Wren, and he lives there with his grandfather. And I just took the whole setting from The Briars, which I had always seen very clearly, and plopped it down into King Sorrow. There was another failed novel called The Surrealist Glass that I started work on between heart-shaped box and horns, and then I quit it because it sucked donkey dick. It was just absolutely dreadful novel. But it did have this interesting supernatural object. Had one good character, and it had an interesting supernatural object, the Surrealist Glass itself. And I took that glass and I lent it to one of the characters in King Sorrow. And it was like, it finally found its place. That was where it was always, I wrote part of the Surrealist Glass so I could metaphorically have the glass in my back pocket and pull it back out later when I needed it for King Sorrow. So everything you've ever written was an early draft of something you'll write later that might actually be good. All the bad stories were early drafts of good stuff that was, going to come later.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, I see it as a kind of training, and it's not as if when we go to the gym and we're lifting that if we fail something, we're like, oh, well, that was a complete waste of time.
Absolutely.
You're building up for the next part, and I see that as analogous and as accurate with writing as well.
Well, and also, let's stay with that metaphor for a second. One of the things the weightlifters talk about is lifting to failure. That you can really build the muscles if sometimes you lift to failure. And I think that's true for early short stories or early novels. Everyone wants, if you spent 2 years of your life, you got a full-time job and a marriage and a kid, you don't have the time to work you want, but it's your hobby. And over 2 years, you write a novel and it's your first novel. No one wants to hear it sucks. You put your heart into it. It was really important to you. You love the characters. You had good concepts and stuff. No one wants to hand it over to their friends or their wife or an agent and hear it's not very good. But those early failures are important. Don't give up. You did good work. Even if that first book is not publishable, you wrote it for you and you lifted to failure. You built muscle. the next time you'll lift more. You'll be more capable and more of the story will come together. For sure, if you're a non-professional, if you love doing it, don't stop because you haven't succeeded yet, and also maybe change your idea about what success looks like. I think there's also that. I changed my idea about what success looked like after a certain point. After a few years of flailing away and not being able to sell any books, I started to think, well, if I sold a book of short stories, that might look like success. If I would say to myself, if I can get in this anthology, that would be success. There was an anthology called, there was a call out for submissions to an anthology called The Many Faces of Van Helsing. It was going to be a book of short stories that would come out the same time as the Hugh Jackman Van Helsing film. Gene Cavalos was the editor. So it was sort of like, it wasn't an official tie-in, but the idea was to kind of draft off all the publicity for the Van Helsing picture. I heard about this open call, and by then I had written a few short stories that had done okay, won some prizes and stuff. But I didn't have a readership. I had never been published in any really big like journal or book or anything. And I saw about this, and I saw it had a big publisher, it was like Signet or something. And I thought, I'm getting in that fucking book. That's what success looks like, if I can get in that book. So I wrote a story called Abraham's Boys. I thought it through. I thought, what can I write about Abraham Van Helsing that hasn't been written? And I had a few ideas, and I had an approach. I wrote a short story. I think it's one of the better ones in 20th Century Ghosts. I got in the collection. I was one of only 3 or 4 people, who were total unknowns who got in that book, and hey, you get a story published in a small journal or something like that, small horror journal with some other writers you admire. That's success, So, yeah, I'm a big fan of, amateurs keeping it going. Not, don't quit on yourself if it's fun, and don't make your fun be about, your exterior triumphs. Keep the focus on, what do you enjoy writing? Did you finish the book? Did you get your pages? Did you write a good scene, a scene you're proud of? And just keep lifting till failure.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of self-imposed pressure these days, and it's perhaps because of this kind of social media, always connected age that we're living in, but where people, rather than just looking at writing the story, they're looking at these other metrics, like they're looking at the Goodreads reviews, they're looking at getting on the bestseller list. But really, Josh Malerman, the author of Bird Box and Incidents Around the House, he says that the only success, the only making it, is making the art itself. It is finishing that story. And that's something that's always stuck with me. If you can find joy in the pursuit of writing itself, then whatever happens, you win every time.
Yeah. This is why, no one who wants to be a writer, and, if there are writers you admire and you want to write your own stuff because you love their work, you don't want to go anywhere near AI. You don't want to have anything to do with it. Don't touch it with a 10-foot pole or whatever, because, the musician who writes a song using AI didn't really write anything. That's like a child turning the crank on a music box and imagining somehow they created the song inside the music box. But you didn't create anything. All you did was turn the handle on a device and it produced a sound, and as far as writing can be tremendously frustrating at times and slow and hard work. Don't let anyone take that work away from you, though. That's where all the meaning is. That's where all the joy is, And I heard an interesting thing a little while ago from an editor, because they see a lot of AI manuscripts now in the slush pile. This editor said, you can always tell when a manuscript was AI created, because when you talk to the writer, if you read 3 chapters and then you talk to the writer about it, they don't really know their own book the way a writer who actually wrote every sentence, made choices about the characters, made choices about the plot, knows their own story, and cares about it and has an intensity to it, an intensity of connection to the material that they wrote. And the person who just churned something out through AI doesn't have that intimate, link with it. And it shows pretty quickly when they start to talk about the work. So, but I just can't imagine, it would feel so hollow to turn something over to readers where you didn't really craft it. You didn't really come up with the plot, come up with the characters, struggle with every sentence. I'm blanking on the writer. Science fiction. There was a science fiction writer who was writing about AI in the Atlantic. Author of the short story that led to the movie Arrival. He said, every work of fiction is the result of thousands of creative choices made day after day, page by page, sentence by sentence, thousands upon thousands of creative choices. And you've skipped all those choices the moment you process something via AI, the moment you turn to AI for creation. And so the end result is there's no artist involved with the art, which makes the art itself fundamentally meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
It's there's no person there. There's nothing there. So yeah. It's like reading something that was written by an AI novel would be like making out with an inflatable sex toy.
Which, whilst it worked for Ryan Gosling in the film
It's
Real
not the kind of
Doll,
relationship you want to have. I don't think that that's really a healthy, mature relationship. You want to have relationships with people.
Yeah.
Even if they're people you'll never meet, but you've seen their mind at work on the page. That's the fun.
And the short story writer you reference, that is Ted Chiang, just for people.
Right.
The way that I explained it to a tech bro about AI was, what if someone created a mod to help you, not just help you, but just beat the bosses in Elden Ring? And, no. That's not the same thing. Yeah, it is.
Yeah, it is. That's just exactly right.
But then you wouldn't have a sense of accomplishment. I think I get it now. Yeah.
It's imagine
go away now. Bye-bye.
Imagine you open up the New York Times crossword in the morning, and then you scan it with your phone, and the AI fills in all the answers. And then you copy the answers off your phone onto the. Why? What a pointless! I can't imagine. I mean, just go wank off. It'd be more fun. It'll come to the same thing. And I mean, like, why? And that's kind of how I feel about, the idea of AI writing and AI film clips. And I find AI music especially obscene. Makes me fucking ill. But anyway, you don't need to hear my whole rant. It's like music. I have this view that like music is at the center of everything, and that music is the most beautiful art form. And that I heard one of these AI engines is producing 9 million songs a day now or something. It's just, I don't know. It's obscene. It's like someone taking a piss on your mother or something. It just feels so fucking wrong. I hate the idea, anyway.
Yeah, well, I think we are all in agreement on AI in this conversation, and I'm sure the vast majority of our listeners too. But, talking about music, what was the music that you were listening to while writing King Sorrow?
So every story I've ever written has had a collection of tunes behind it. And most of the books have had playlists that I turn to get in the right mindset. But I worked on King Sorrow for a long time. I mean, I spent 3 years writing King Sorrow, maybe even a little bit more. And so it's impossible to really condense 3 years of musical wandering into one record or 2 records or something. I mean, you know, I went through phases. I was listening to a lot of Oasis, but I always listened to a lot of Oasis. I was listening to a lot of Liam Gallagher, but I always listened to a lot of Liam Gallagher. Mumford & Sons, the Lumineers, you know, there's a lot of this kind of Chris Stapleton, great. He's country rock, but in the 70s, he would have just been rock and roll. He would have just been a guy like Bob Seger. Bob's nodding. Bob's like, you're a Chris Stapleton guy.
I'm all kinds of music guy, but yes, I listen to everything, man. I go from Coltrane to Slayer. So I've got my
you're always
shirt
discovering
on.
Stuff where you're like, how did I miss this? I mean, just in the last couple of years, I've discovered how great Nazareth was back in the day. I think I stayed away from them when I was growing up because I thought they'd be too hard for me. You know, that Hair of the Dog and stuff like that would just be too, you know, it would just go too hard. I loved Zeppelin and AC/DC, but I think I thought that, you know, that Nazareth was going to be like Megadeth or something, that it was going to be speed metal. And then a few years ago, I started listening to it. I thought, this is exactly the kind of thing I love. I love this kind of, you know, this is right in my sweet spot. Why did I wait so long? I'm a 50-something American dad. I walk into the supermarket, Eddie Money is playing. I'm like, wow, this place rocks. Let's buy some eggplants. This place rules. Stevie Nicks comes on. Yeah. Let's go. Get some milk. So, yeah. There you go.
I mean, who can't like Stevie Nicks and Fleetwood Mac? What would be wrong with you if you didn't, quite frankly?
Lindsey Buckingham, I think he's got a new solo album coming out. You know, that Buckingham Nicks album that was sort of like a lost classic from 73 has just reemerged digitally. That's a great record. That's got some terrific stuff on it. There's 2 or 3 tracks on it that's as good as anything on Rumors. There's 2 tracks on it that are Rumors level. It's easier sometimes with short stories because short stories don't stick around long enough to get more than 4 or 5 songs attached to them. Yeah, but a book that takes 2 or 3 years. I remember with Nosferatu, I listened to a lot of Steve Miller, and some of that comes through in the book. You know, I think that Vic thinks about, you know, abracadabra, I want to reach out and grab you when she's a kid and she first discovers her psychic powers.
Mm-hmm. Do you read while writing, or is writing a solitary thing and you can't read anybody's work while you're writing?
I know some writers who say I never read fiction while I'm working on a novel. Well, if I never read fiction, I love fiction. I love to read. I love novels. I love other writers. I'm a lot more interested in other writers than I am in my own writing, you know, and if I never read novels while I was writing my own novels, I guess I would never read novels because I'm always writing a novel, you know. So I did for a few years. I was a huge horror fan right up through the 90s, the early 90s. And then around the mid 90s when I started trying to get published, and maybe more towards the late 90s, I guess. I started reading less horror fiction because I didn't want to be influenced by what other people were doing. But I got over that like about 6 or 7 years ago, and now I'm back to reading horror fiction as mine. I don't really. I think it's an understandable concern, but that's a young writer's concern, and you know, isn't, I don't think is very valid. I mean, it's like, you know, I'm not saying I can't fall under the influence of another writer, but I feel like I have a sense for my own voice. And actually, I'm so used to writing stories the way I write them. And my voice is so sort of, you know, it's just the way I write. it's just the way I think about sentences and paragraphs and stuff, that actually I don't know what I could read that would kind of pull me off that. It'd be really interesting if something could sort of pull me out of that, that ditch that I've dug for myself, that, my general approach. But I don't really feel like, I can read someone like Keith Rawson's Coffin Moon and just be blown away, just be like, what a great book, but I'm still stuck writing books the way I write them. I can't figure out how to write them like Keith writes them. I can't, that doesn't mean I can't learn. I'm not trying to, I was thinking, about 10 years ago, I fell in love with a TV show called Foyle's War, a fair play mystery series out of England about a detective, a kind of Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot type, named Foyle, Detective Superintendent Foyle, who lives in a small town on the coast of England and solves crimes during World War II. He's too old to fight. He wants to fight, but he's told to remain a cop. And I loved those mysteries, almost all of which were written by the great crime writer Anthony Horowitz. And then I moved on into reading Anthony Horowitz's novels, which are also fair play mysteries. And a fair play mystery means all the clues are there on the page. And if you're really clever, you can solve the mystery alongside the detective, or maybe even beat the detective to the solution. The fact is, if it's ingeniously constructed, you're never going to beat the detective to it. That's just not going to happen. You're not smart enough. I'm not smart enough. You're not smart enough. It's not happening. Although I watched so much Foyle's War that towards the end, sometimes I did spot it. I started to think, oh, wait a minute. That was just a bit of misdirection. I know what we were supposed to really pay attention to in that scene, and it wasn't this, it was that other thing. So anyway, I've read a lot of Anthony Horowitz, and I've watched all his TV shows and stuff, and gradually I kind of absorbed how to do a fair play mystery, and I've written a few. Often I try things out in comics before I try them out on the page. So I wrote a fair play mystery called Shit Talk Holmes. I think most of my stuff has landed pretty well. Shit Talk is the only thing I ever wrote where I think mostly people didn't. That one kind of belly flopped. I like it, but it's not really, I don't think it's really what my readers want me to do. But I still had practice with the fair play mystery. I was asked to write a Sherlock Holmes story by the Arthur Conan Doyle estate, and I wrote that, and I think that's a pretty good story, and that's a fair play one. That'll be out like some point next year, I think.
And this Shit Talk Home story, is this available anywhere?
It's called Dying is Easy, which comes from an old phrase. I forget who said it. Some comedian of the 70s or 80s said, comedy is hard, dying is easy, by which he meant dying on stage. So Dying is Easy is about a former city detective. We don't know what city. Maybe it's New York. Maybe it's Chicago. Could be Detroit. Hard to say. But there's this former homicide detective named Sid Holmes, who's got a mouth on him. He's very hard to like. And so around on the force, he was known as Shit Talk Holmes. And he's drummed out of the force after a tragedy. And so he's sifting around for what to do with himself and decides to see if he can make a go as a stand-up comedian. So his day job is I guess it's a night job. He's working hard to try to make it as a stand-up comic. And it's not clear if he's really funny enough. His humor is all very morbid cop humor. But there's another comedian who's on his way up. And they're doing the same club together. And this other comedian steals jokes. He's even stolen some of Sid's jokes, which is a huge crime in the stand-up community. Stealing jokes is an absolute no-no. But this guy is on his way up. He's going to be doing late night, and he doesn't care. And he winds up dead. And everyone thinks Shit Talk did it. So Shit Talk has to find the real killer. And there's red herrings and misdirection and a whole set of suspects. And at the end, I think the solution does make sense. So it's done as a graphic novel through IDW and has a terrific artist named Martin Simmons who worked on it and then later went on to do a big hit comic called The Department of Truth. And Martin is great. It was fun. But I think my other comics, Lock and Key, Basket Full of Head, Plunge, that stuff is in the weird fantasy horror genre, and my readership likes that kind of thing, and I don't think is necessarily opposed to something that swings in the direction of crime, but maybe Sid Talk swung too far that way, that it's kind of like, I don't know, Columbo or something. I'm not sure anyone wanted me to write Columbo. I still was glad I did it. You got to do stuff you got to take chances and get outside your comfort zone now and then.
We are already coming up to the time that we have together.
Yeah.
We've barely spoken about King Sorrow, but people can just go out and buy the book, read the book. You don't need us to.
Really, the book speaks for itself. The only way it's less. We could talk about it start talking about King Sorrow and talk about it for another hour. But I think it's obvious that people you want to enrich your life and grow as a person. The best way to do that is just experience King Sorrow yourself by picking up a copy in hardcover, ebook, or audio, available from all vendors at very, very reasonable prices. It's rare to get so much excitement, so much fantasy and imagination, but also so much cultured wisdom between the covers of a single volume, for one very affordable price. So, beyond that, I don't know that there's even anything else to be said about King Sorrow.
It's such a eloquent and polite pitch. I was just going to say, if you like horror, read it. If you like fantasy, read it. And it's got a big fucking dragon on the cover. That was the pitch for me.
Yeah.
Well, I was trying to be modest about it. I didn't want to oversell it.
There you go.
It's made me want to read more fantasy, which I'm like severely lacking in fantasy. I grew up when Harry Potter came out, I was already at the age where I'm going to go out and party and chase girls and all that.
Yeah.
And so I missed all that. I missed Goosebumps. I missed all of that.
Yeah, me too, actually. I did read Harry Potter as it came out because I had a professional interest, and then I kind of wound up falling into the stories. And
yeah, I've never read any of them.
And the writer turned out to be a little bit of a bummer, but that's a whole other conversation. We don't got to get into that. We didn't touch on this, but of course, this is horror podcast, and the big elephant in the room is that some people don't think King Sorrow is horror at all. I think it is. I think that. Especially in that it's one story about 6 friends who bring a dragon into our world. They smash reality and bring a dragon into our world, and then have to live with him for the next quarter century. And they have to find a new sacrifice for him every year for the rest of their lives, or he'll take one of them. And we get, within one book, we get these sort of smaller mini novels where each of the characters becomes the main character for a while in their own tale, their own tightly compressed tale of suspense and the unnatural. Mm-hmm. And I think for sure that some of those stories are pretty outright horror. The second part 2 is called Flight of Fright, and takes place on an airplane at 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, on a flight from New York to London, and there's a terrorist on board, and there's a dragon outside the windows fighting F-16s. And I think that's pretty scary, but Goodreads put it in the fantasy category when it got nominated for a Goodreads, fantasy of the year instead of in the horror category. So opinions differ. I just want to say, I know we have to wrap things up, but I just want to say that if King Sorrow had been a werewolf or a zombie or a vampire, it would have been horror. Because he's a dragon, I think some people feel that instantly makes it fantasy. But you have to ask yourself why. Because all of these monsters are creatures of the imagination. They're all invented. Why is a werewolf definitionally horror, but a dragon is definitionally, fantasy? That doesn't follow with me. And also, giant monster movies, like Them about giant ants, or the one about the giant spiders, those are horror films. Is Godzilla fantasy? Science fiction? I thought Godzilla was horror. But what's the difference between Godzilla and a dragon? I don't think there is one. I mean, in the later Toho films, he can fly, for God's sake, kind of. Doesn't he fly in some of the later ones? And so I think briefly that those kinds of terms, fantasy, horror, science fiction, they're very useful for booksellers. They're very useful for marketers. They don't always tell the reader all that much.
No, didn't they call, like, when Peter Straub's Floating Dragon came out, didn't they call that dark fantasy? I'm pretty sure
Maybe.
very few people didn't call it horror.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Maybe it's the dragon connection. You got a physical dragon in yours, he had a metaphorical dragon in his. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I don't know.
This is what I was going to say. I think there's bias from some people that immediately you mention a dragon, now it's fantasy. But if you look at King Sorrow, I mean, for goodness sake, there is a seance to summon the dragon, and then you have to sacrifice someone every Easter. It doesn't get any more horror than that.
Well, and there's a monstrous and dangerous poltergeist in the book named Elwood Hondo.
Yeah.
Which is pretty good. There's at one point we're talking about giant spiders. At one point, two of my heroes are attacked by a painting that comes to life, and it's a painting of 1,000 little spiders, and the spiders are all biting them and crawling all over them, which is pretty horror. However, in that same section of the book, they're being led through a cavern by a troll. Now that's pretty fantasy. So, a little bit of... But what's wrong with mixing the chocolate and the peanut butter together? I thought that was a good thing. It's that mix of the sweet and savory that really makes a hamburger. You want the hamburger, but you want the sweet barbecue sauce on top. It's what gives it that zing. Hey guys, this was great. Thanks so much for talking to me. I had a blast.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts to leave our listeners and viewers with?
Final thought. Well, I don't know if I have final thoughts. I'll give you my final recommendations. They were in my newsletter too. My 4 favorite scary books of the year were Coffin Moon by Keith Rawson, Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman, When the Wolf Comes Home by Nat Cassidy, and The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. And then the 4 favorite films were Sinners, Dangerous Animals. I'm going to blank on one of them. The Long Walk was one, which I actually think it's a funny place to end the podcast, but I actually think The Long Walk is one of the 5 best Stephen King adaptations. I like the hell out of that movie. What was the last one? I don't know. I have a newsletter on Substack. I think if you sign up, you can find the archive and look at the back issues. It's called Escape Hatch. And, if you look it up on Substack or go to my website, you can sign up for it. And, and then I'm blabbing at you every month. Who doesn't want that? Listen, actually, anyone who's listening to this podcast obviously already has questionable taste. So they probably love my newsletter. So zip right on over to joehillfiction.com and sign up. Bob, Michael, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to Joe Hill on This Is Horror. Join us again next time when we will be talking to Eric LaRocca about his latest book, Burnt Sparrow. It is a very thought-provoking book, and in many ways may be both his most experimental and most challenging book in all meanings of the word. Now, if you want to get that episode and every other episode ahead of the crowd, plus the ability to submit questions to all the wonderful writers we chat with, including our next guest, Dean Koontz, then become a patron at patreon.com/thisishorror. Not only will you get a multitude of benefits, but in supporting the podcast, you are enabling me to live my dream and do this full time. Something I am taking very seriously. Now, you may have noticed the podcast is now releasing episodes twice per week, and we've really increased our video presence on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. So by all means, check out each of those. And if you like what you see, give us a follow. The handle for all of them is at This Is Horror Podcast. Okay, before I wrap up, a quick advert break.
It was as if the video had unzipped my skin, slunk inside my tapered flesh, and become one with me.
From the creator of This Is Horror comes a new nightmare for the digital age, The Girl in the Video by Michael David Wilson. After a teacher receives a weirdly arousing video, his life descends into paranoia and obsession. More videos follow, each containing information no stranger could possibly know. But who's sending them, and what do they want? The answers may destroy everything and everyone he loves. The Girl in the Video is The Ring meets Fatal Attraction for the iPhone generation. Available now in paperback, ebook, and audio. From the host of This Is Horror Podcast comes a dark thriller of obsession, paranoia, and voyeurism. After relocating to a small coastal town, Brian discovers a hole that gazes into his neighbor's bedroom. Every night she dances and he peeps. Same song, same time, same wild and mesmerizing dance. But soon Brian suspects he's not the only one watching, and she's not the only one being watched. They're watching is The Wicker Man meets Body Double with a splash of Suspiria. They're Watching by Michael David Wilson and Bob Pastorella is available from thisishorror.co.uk, Amazon, and wherever good books are sold.
Now, I said that next week we are chatting with Eric LaRocca. And one of the reasons is that we have invited each 2024 This Is Horror Award winner onto the show. And Eric's fantastic short story collection, This Skin Was Once Mine, won the Short Story Collection of the Year. If you want to see the full list of winners, just head over to thisishorror.co.uk right now. Well, that about does it for another episode of This Is Horror. I'll see you next time for the fantastic conversation with Eric LaRocca. But until then, take care of yourselves, be good to one another, read horror, keep on writing, and have a great, great day.
This is Horror Podcast.